Hello again, everyone. Last week I put something in our email newsletter saying that if you had any questions that you wanted me to answer, I'd send them up to me and I'd try and get round to them. And I'm really glad to say that Marie came back to me and she's asked me a question which we get again and again on the Ask a Banbury Vet Facebook site, which is about separation anxiety. So separation anxiety is essentially the distress, the anxiety that's caused mostly in dogs when they're separated from us, their loving owners. So I just thought I'd go for sort of 10 minutes or so and look at the sort of whys, how we can treat it, how we can prevent it, that sort of thing. So I guess the first question is, why do dogs get separation anxiety? Why is this such a problem? Why do we see it in so many dogs? Well, the first and most obvious thing to say is that dogs are primarily a pack animal. They're a really social animal and they've evolved to live in groups. So if you look at, we've only got to look at maybe a couple of weeks ago on Dynasties, that excellent new Sunday night Attenborough programme, where we looked at the painted wolves, and you look at the packs that they live in, sort of 20 to 50 strong, and our dogs aren't a million miles away from them, and keeping them singly in a house on their own isn't normal, and it causes them a certain amount of existential dread because they've evolved to actually be around other dogs. So that's the first cause. The second cause of separation anxiety may be a memory. Maybe they were stuck in a house and something went wrong, maybe fireworks, or maybe there was a burglar, or some kind of traumatic memory, and they've ended up becoming really worried about being on their own. And thirdly, the third reason would be that a companion animal has passed away. So maybe they were kept in a group of 2 or 3, and maybe the leader, the alpha, or one of their pack mates has passed away. And as a result, just like us, they're now suffering from a certain amount of anxiety and grief. And the fourth reason that I usually put down for this is boredom. A dog, contrary to expectations with some dogs, that they are intelligent animals, and they do need a certain amount of psychological stimulation, and if they don't have sort of environmental stimulation, then they can end up essentially becoming quite stressed by their environment. They have very little control over their environment, and if they don't like it, that can cause a certain amount of stress, and that can then lead to anxiety. So those are the four major causes. So we're looking at, it's normal, there's a memory of a problem, one of their companions has died, and it's a boredom issue as well. So what sort of signs do we commonly see? Well, destruction, so digging at carpets, chewing furniture, chewing skirting boards, that sort of thing. They can howl. They can bark. There's generally, like babies have different cries for different reasons. Dogs have different howls and barks for different reasons. So that kind of long, plaintive howl can be a sign of just stress and anxiety. Sometimes sort of, I suppose, like an excitable yipping can be a sign of it as well. Urinating in the house as well. Basically, anxiety can lead to a sense of not belonging within their environment, and so they try to up the number of their pheromones in their environment to kind of create their own territory, and that tends to lower anxiety for them. And one of the final things that we see with dogs that suffer from separation anxiety is like a really hyper excitability when you come back into the house. Like, oh my God, you've been gone for years. It's so good to see you again. They're jumping around. Now, I realise some dogs, like our lurchers, they barely notice when you come in the house. To some dogs which are very happy to see you. But then we kind of really go up the spectrum to dogs which are sort of pathologically excited when they see you. And I'm sure people who've had dogs with separation anxiety can probably list a couple of other signs, but those would be the sort of the general most common signs that we see. Before we go on to prevention, because that's a really tricky topic, let's talk about treatment of it. Let's talk about prevention of it. it's really important when they're little, just as we socialise them to different kind of stimuli outside, so cars, motorbikes, people with beards, going out on walks, seeing other dogs, etc., etc. It's quite a good idea at a young age to introduce them to the idea of being on their own. Now, I'll come on to this in a little bit in the treatment side of things, but essentially you should never make it a scary experience. As soon as, our brains are incredible learning machines, and traumatic events really go very deep into our brains and produce very solid learning. So if you punish a dog for howling or for peeing in the house when they've been on their own, you can end up making connections that really you didn't want to make. It should, basically, when you're introducing young dogs to being on their own, I'm literally sort of maybe put them behind a baby gate with a toy for a little while and then go get them again. So they've hardly noticed that you've been away. And essentially over a period of time, they'll get used to the idea of, I can be on my own, I can play on my own. That's all absolutely fine. So you're trying to create good memories for them, good learning experiences. Now, the problem with dogs which suffer from separation anxiety is that they have got pathological thought processes, and because it's a traumatic, anxious thing for them, these memories, this sort of learning, these neural pathways that they've built up can be extremely strong and very, very difficult to break. So first things first, don't reinforce those strong neural pathways. Anything that causes them further anxiety, further stress, essentially won't work. You'll just light those pathways up again, and just like ruts on a country lane, they'll just get deeper and more solid and more permanent and more difficult to eradicate. So punishment is definitely out. It just doesn't work. There is no point shouting, punishing by separation or physical, or however you might be tempted to punish them. It just doesn't work in these cases. What you need to do is desensitize them to being left alone. Now, my wife, she's very into sort of natural horsemanship and training, and she has a really good saying, which is, take the time it takes so it takes less time. So take the time it takes so it takes less time. So training a dog out of separation anxiety takes effort, and it takes commitment, possibly long-term commitment, and in some dogs it could be lifelong, because those traumatic memories are so deeply embedded. You essentially never eradicate them. You just have to keep on going over the same ground again and again, essentially saying, it's trying to teach them it's fine to be alone. So there is a fine line between desensitization and sensitization. So what do we mean by desensitization? Essentially, desensitization means recurrent exposure to the stimulus that creates the stress at a low level. So it doesn't actually quite cause the stress. So as you can see, it's very easy to get that level wrong and pop over the level into causing the stress. And at that point, you're starting to sensitize them. You're reinforcing that separation anxiety again. So it's really, really important to start at a really ridiculously low level and take it slowly. If you ever cause stress during the training, that anxious stress, you've lost. You need to go back almost to the beginning again and build it up. So separation anxiety, it's the separation that causes the stress. So we're going to have to think about a ladder of increasing separation, slowly, 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 causing them no anxiety or stress as we build it up over time. So let's take the typical dog. You go out, you close the door, and you come back an hour later and there's pee everywhere, they've destroyed the place, and the neighbours complain they've been howling all day. What can we practically do for that dog to stop this stressful behaviour? So the first thing that I would do is perhaps consider just asking them to leave the room, feed them outside the room where you're sitting in an evening, and invite them back in again. So that's a pretty low stress thing. Once they're happy with that, maybe you can close the door slightly, then perhaps close the door completely while they're eating. Then perhaps you can do it in a separate room, you know, the utility room. The problem comes that, so we're starting to build up the ladder there, and you can imagine how this might progress over time. The problem comes that normal life has to go on. So we all have to leave the house occasionally. And every time you do that, you're reinforcing that stressful behaviour. So there has to be commitment from yourself to interrupt those behaviours that cause that stress. So whilst you're doing this, you might want to consider, can we leave somebody in the house during the day? You know, can we leave some, rather than the whole family go out, can perhaps I or my partner stay at home with the dog just to stop that behaviour coming back? I mean, sometimes it's completely unavoidable. So, you know, perhaps we could do something like, can they go to a dog sitter's? Can they go to a friend's to the day? Will someone take them on? Just to stop these pathways being reinforced every single time you go out of the house. So getting rid of treating separation anxiety can be really tricky and really time consuming, and it takes a great deal of commitment and effort to essentially abolish those behaviours, routines in the house that cause the stress, whilst actually still maintaining a normal life, and then also doing those positive things to try and stop the separation anxiety. And again, you know, this can be lifelong. Now, there are things that can help, but there are no shortcuts. So there are drugs that might be able to help, and you know, we can think of drugs like sertraline or Prozac or Clomicalm, those sort of drugs, you know, these antidepressants, SSRIs, those anxiolytic drugs to try and help reduce the anxiety. Or we can look at sort of pheromones, so dog appeasing pheromones, Adaptil, those sort of things. But really they're only, you know, they're not the solution on their own. They can be used alongside all these other things, and certainly in crisis, we can even look at maybe mild sedation as well. And I've done a video on sort of tranquilization versus sedation to try and help them out with all this. But essentially, it takes time, it takes effort. And I would encourage you that if this is a deep-rooted thing that you're really struggling with, I think this is one of the things that a behaviourist can really help with. You know, somebody come around to the house, look at the structure, look at your routine, because ultimately, you know, a dog that's destroying our house, is peeing in the house, is annoying the neighbours, is incredibly stressful for us as well. And you know, that stress can then be sort of reflected back on the animal, and then suddenly, you know, it's not enjoyable anymore. You know, having these our love pets in our home should be an enjoyable, reciprocal, positive experience. And I know that when things start to break down like this, it can be really tricky to even see a way out. And you know, talking to behaviourists, taking their advice, someone who comes out, can really help. So I hope this helps with separation anxiety. Any questions, pop them in the comments below and I'll try to address them. Bye.